Good afternoon, North Harbor. It's time for our midweek devotional, and I wanted to look at just a few verses at the end of Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. So we looked at Acts, the larger part of Acts chapter 2 on our sermon on Sunday. You can go on our website and check that out. But at the end here, there's what we call a summary statement, and there's lots of these in the book of Acts, a number of these that sort of summarize what this new community of believers are doing. And it says in verse 42, Acts chapter 2, 42 to 47, it says, they all gave full attention to the teaching of the apostles and to the common life and to breaking of bread and to prayers. Great awe fell on everyone, and many remarkable deeds and signs were performed by the apostles. All of those who believed came together and held everything in common. They sold their possessions and belongings and divided them up to everyone in proportion to their various needs. Day by day, they were all gathering together, attending the temple. They broke bread with at their various houses and ate their food with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and standing in favor with all the people. And every day the Lord added to their number those who were being rescued. I love this statement. And so, first of all, a little bit of context. We're going to give a literary context in the book of Luke and some historical context later on, some geographical context later on as I finish this thought. But remember that Jesus says to his apostles, he says, you will go and bear witness about the resurrection, about Jesus, beginning in Jerusalem, then to Judea and Samaria, then to the other parts of the world, the ends of the world. And so we are seeing here what that looks like in Jerusalem. And it's worth remembering that this is the direction of the community. It's to go out. It's to push out. And right now we're in Jerusalem. We're going to see a couple of events here, but it's going to move out, move out, move out, move out. And so that is the context of this community that shares everything in common, this community that praises God and prays together, is about moving out and taking this message to other communities. And that's the context of all this life, this summary of this sort of inside look into what the earliest church was doing, how they worshiped and how they met together. And we have four things that are listed. It says they give their full attention. This is the word for devoted. Some of your Bibles may read devoted or committed themselves. They devoted themselves. They spent so much energy. They gave their energy, their resources, their time, to these things, these four things that are mentioned here. They devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles. So they're continuing to learn about Jesus, to learn about what life with God and life in God's community looks like in the first century. They're devoted themselves to understanding it and growing in insight and wisdom and all those sort of things. The teaching of the apostles, the common life, we often read this as fellowship. I think we think of fellowship as just hanging out and spending time together and enjoying each other's company. But this is bigger than that. This is, the community has these things in common. This communion, worship, praise, prayer, learning, all of these things, the things that we own, the things that we have that we can share with one another. This is fellowship. This is the common good. We're going to support and love on one another. That is what fellowship means here. They are devoted to the teaching of the apostles, the common life, to the breaking of bread, which is communion. Communion is a celebration somehow in church history. I'm not a historian, but somewhere along the line, it became this really solemn, introspective thing. But this is a celebration of the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, his sacrifice for us, and what God is doing in the world as we celebrate communion. So I would really love to see communion become, once again, the centerpiece of what worship is all about, and that being a celebration. The breaking of bread and prayers. And so they devoted themselves to prayer. And during these difficult times, during pandemic land, I think we should be devoted to prayer and to learning and to supporting one another. during this time. And that's what the early church did. And then it sort of fleshes this out. It says, all those who believed came together and held everything in common. They sold their possessions and belongings and divided them up to everyone in proportion to their various needs. I think some people, I heard this just yesterday. Someone said, that takes so much faith. How come I don't have the faith to sell everything I have and just trust God? If God is leading you to do that, then do that, and that takes a tremendous amount of faith for sure. But as we read Acts, this is not describing a community that just sells everything and puts it in a common pot for the church to distribute. As we read through Acts, we realize that people have property. It's not a commune. What it is describing is that this community comes together and supports one another, and we support the work of God and one another with our resources, our homes, our cars, our cash. But when there is a need, we step into the lives of one another and we support it. It's not necessarily saying we all have to sell everything and put it into a common bank account for the church to distribute. And as we read Acts, even as soon as chapter 4 and 5, we see that this is the case. That sometimes that happens, but even if that doesn't happen, the things that we have are used for the common good, that there is a movement of God among these people within community, and it's happening within this community. Now, last week I talked about how when God is doing mighty things, when Jesus says you're going to do mighty things, he's talking about among you. So it's not so much that Jesus says, Dan will do greater things than me. What he's saying is that you as a community will do greater things than me. And we're going to see that happen in Acts chapter 3 and 4 as we look at the first healing that happens. But part of that is just this life together, that we are in life together. And even though I have my house here and other people have their house there, we use the things that we have for this community to grow and to develop and to go forth. And it says they sold their possessions, their belongings, divided them up to everyone in proportion to their various needs. Day by day, they were all together attending the temple. They broke bread in their various homes and ate their food with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and standing in favor with all the people. And every day the Lord added to their number those that were being rescued. I love this. Salvation is described as being rescued, and it's a process of being rescued. And it's God's work. God is adding to their number. It's not I've been in churches where there's a lot of stress and a lot of energy about what we're doing to win the lost. Here, it's very clear that God is bringing the power behind all this. God is rescuing people. But the community is the vehicle where that happens. God's community, God's people. The other thing I want to point out, this is really important, is it talks about the temple. The temple is going to become a little bit more prominent here. There's a lot of activity around the temple. The temple is the heartbeat of Judaism, the heartbeat of the community, the religious community. And we all know that Jesus, went into the temple and turned tables over and was very critical of the institution of the temple. And so what we're going to see here, this is remarkable, is that God is beginning to redefine the location of the temple, and it's beginning to shift from a building over to this community. This community is where people's needs are met. The community is where praise happens. The community is where prayer happens. The community is where God is active. Now, in Judaism, that was always in the temple. And when you look to the Old Testament and you read passages about what God's people should look like, what God's people should look like, we're seeing these things listed right here in this short passage, that people's needs are taken care of, that prayer happens, that teaching happens, that the breaking of bread and the celebration of God and all his wondrous deeds happen. And so what we see here early on in the book of Acts is there is a shift now. The focus was once on the temple, and now it's being shifted. The temple and the presence of God and where people go to find the divine presence of God is shifting over to the community, God's community, the church, the early church. And That's an amazing shift. And God and Jesus talked about this. Jesus talked about this happening. We see it in Paul's letters to the churches in Ephesians and Colossians about how God is building a temple, and that he is uniting various people groups and building a new community and that is where God's presence will happen. So as we move on in this study of Acts, be considering those things and devote yourselves to learning, devote yourselves to prayer, devote yourselves to meeting each other's needs, and be committed to praising God in the process. So, may North Harbor and the larger church community be a place where people discover God and his presence as it moves out into the world in very powerful ways. All right, we'll see you on Sunday. God bless.